All right, let's move on to Standard 4, which discusses duties to employers under the Code of Financial Ethics. So there are three categories, A, B, and C. We're going to start with Standard 4A, which deals with loyalty. So loyalty in matters related to the employment, members and candidates must act for the benefit of their employer and not deprive their employer of the advantage of their skills and abilities, divulge confidential information, or otherwise cause harm to their employer. So essentially what that means is you've got to give your employer your best efforts. Keep the things that you learn that are proprietary with your employer, even when you leave, and try to avoid harm in all circumstances to your employer. So with that said, the interest of your clients are paramount. So, and they always come above the interest to yourself or to your employer. But that said, you cannot harm the interest of your employer, deprive it of profit or your skill and ability. You must comply with your employer policies and procedures. While it's implied that you'll comply with your employer policies and procedures, it's also recognized that it has to be a balance between personal interest and employer interest. So therefore, if something comes up that is of utmost importance in your personal life or something that's an interest of your clients, then there is an expectation that your employer will have a balance. The employer also has a responsibility to provide a positive, ethical workplace, which includes a fair compensation structure to ensure that it makes sense to comply with ethical standards and codes. And one suggestion is that candidates and members of the CFA should provide a copy of the code and standards to your employer. So many people are working part-time as consultants, but whether you're working part-time as a consultant or whether you're a full-time employee, one of the things that you have to abstain from is independent practice that's competitive with your employer. So you must notify your employer and describe the work, duration of service, and the expected compensation if you're doing something that either is directly in competition or may be implied to be in competition with your employer. So the best thing to do is that if you're in doubt, get your employer's consent in writing for independent practice. You do not need consent for outside work that is not a conflict with employer. So if you're doing something totally unrelated to financial advising, then you are free to do that without the consent of your employer. If you decide to leave your employer, you still have a duty of loyalty until the resignation is effective. And what that basically means, you're going to put your best effort in. Try to increase the profitability of your employer. In addition, preparation to work elsewhere must not harm your current employer. So that means that you should not allow it to be a distraction to your commitment and focus to your current work. More specifically, potential violations include any of the following. If you take any trade secrets, if you misuse confidential information, if you solicit existing clients, any self-dealing, anything that promotes yourself as over your employer, and any taking over client lists. Lists belong to your employer, they're not yours, even if you've produced the client base that you service. So we all develop skills and knowledge in the workplace, and any proficiency, skills, or knowledge you gain are certainly you will be expected to take it to your next workplace. That is not confidential or privileged information. Also, you can contact your former clients and ask to let them know about your current employment or new employment status. So you can contact your former clients as long as you do not use your former employer's records and it does not violate a non-compete agreement. So many employers require a non-compete agreement. Often that limits your ability to use anything from the firm for a period of time. Could be a couple of months, could be a couple of years, but you obviously have to comply with that. And you also have to follow employer rules about contacting clients using social media. So social media is also a means by which you might take advantage of an opportunity to attract clients. And if there are rules about that, then you should abide by them. The best thing to do is maintain separate personal and professional social media accounts. On occasion, you may find your employer's interest to be secondary to your client's interest in protecting the integrity of the capital market. So keep in mind that your client's interest in protecting the integrity of the capital market is always a higher priority than your employer's interest and or your personal interest. In some cases, this may require whistleblowing. So what whistleblowing is in the United States is a means of communicating something that's adverse about a person or your employer to a third party who has the opportunity to intervene either ethically or legally into a situation. But the thing to keep in mind is if you decide to go outside of your firm to communicate negative information, it has to be done with the intent of either protecting your clients or the integrity of the markets and not for personal gain. All right, let's look at a couple of case studies as regard to Section 4A loyalty. All right, so the first case is Eaton is a senior portfolio manager with Tyson Brothers Investments. He works part-time as the mayor for his hometown, a position for which he receives compensation. He does not disclose the position to Tyson and does not get Tyson's consent prior to campaigning for the position. Eaton's actions are what? So in this case, they're appropriate because the position of mayor does not compete with his employer. Okay, let's look at a second one. Hightower, a senior portfolio manager and member of his firm's investment policy committee, decides to leave his current employer to start his own investment management firm. Before leaving, he takes copies of documents and information he developed or has worked on, including research reports, marketing presentations he prepared, and a list of securities he had been considering as investments for his clients. Hightower's actions are inappropriate because they're taking material without permission, and this violates his duty of loyalty to his firm. So had he notified his firm and asked them, and they had agreed to it, that would have been fine, but you can't just take materials. I'll let you go through the last one on your own. Okay, so let's look at standard 4B, additional compensation arrangements. Members and candidates must not accept gifts, benefits, compensation, or consideration that competes with or might reasonably be expected to create a conflict of interest with their employer's interests, unless they obtain a written consent from all parties involved. So what must happen if you want additional compensation arrangements? So this addresses supplemental third-party payments for services rendered to your employer. Also addresses any services that might create a conflict with your employee's interest. Allows your employer to evaluate any conflicts of interest. Compensation can be direct or an indirect benefit. You must have written consent. Especially important if you're working part-time for several employers. Let's look at a few cases. Whitman is a portfolio manager for Adams Trust. She manages the account of Cochran, who pays ATC a standard fee on the value of assets in her portfolio. Cochran promises Whitman that any year her portfolio achieves at least a 15% return before taxes, Whitman can use Cochran's condominium in the Cannes during the annual International Film Festival. Whitman accepts the offer. Whitman's actions are inappropriate unless she gets full written consent ahead from all parties. Let's look at the next one. Kingery, a money manager for a firm serving high net worth individuals, also sits on the board of directors of Exercise Unlimited, a global fitness company. In return for her services on the board, Kingery receives unlimited membership privileges for his family at all Exercise Unlimited facilities. Kingery purchases Exercise Unlimited stock for the client's accounts for which it's appropriate. Kingery's actions are appropriate only if Kingery receives written consent from the employer and Exercise Unlimited to serve on the board. Okay, and I'll let you read through this last case study. So when we're dealing with Section 4B, the compliance practice, disclose any additional compensation to your employer, seek third-party confirmation of the additional compensation arrangement, that ideally in writing, and disclose the terms of the arrangement, including nature, duration, and the amount of compensation to all parties. So in summary, Section 4B prohibits acceptance of any benefits or compensation that competes with employees' interest unless you have consent. The standard covers gifts from clients and providing any services that conflict with the employee's interest, whether you get paid or not. The benefits can be direct or indirect. Consent from all parties must be written, especially critical when working for a third party. Working for several employers. So as you progress in your career, one of the things that you may have the opportunity to do is to be a supervisor or a manager. And Standard 4C discusses what your ethical responsibilities are as a supervisor or manager. So members and candidates must make reasonable efforts to ensure that anyone subject to their supervision or authority complies with applicable laws, rules, regulations, and the code and standards. So what this requires is that you make reasonable efforts to detect and prevent violations. Okay, and that will depend on the situation. So you have to understand what constitutes an adequate compliance system. You need to monitor people's activities, review their investments, and so forth, anticipate activities most likely to result in misconduct, and then create compliance programs appropriate for the size and nature of the organization. And then finally, make reasonable efforts to ensure procedures are monitored and enforced. So it's not enough just to have them, you also are responsible for monitoring and enforce them. An effective compliance system includes the following: code of ethics, set of policies and procedures that are clear and read by everybody, a review of employee conduct on a regular basis, education and training programs essential, and an appropriate incentive structure. Right? So if you have all of these things in place, that leads towards the ultimate goal, which is a culture of integrity. And the appropriate incentive and structure is really important because we want to make sure that people are fairly compensated for the work they do. Developing effective compliance procedure is insufficient without determining whether they are being followed. Right? So it's not enough just to have them, you have to check and make sure. You may have supervisory responsibility without the authority to enact or modify firm-wide procedures. Okay, so you might not be able to modify them, but if you find something that's inadequate, you have to bring that to the attention of management. And if they refuse to make the changes, you should decline the role as a supervisor or a manager, because you can't be effective, you can't be in compliance with the code if there are inadequate compliance systems in place. So a code of ethics is a critical component to effectively exercising supervisory responsibility. It should consist of principle-based concepts, should be implemented through separately detailed policies and procedures, and should be written in plain language to stress that employees must act with integrity. And then you should convene regular ethics and compliance training. Very important in this industry. Conduct that constitutes reasonable supervision depends on the number of employees and the nature of their work. So it's going to vary, right? So if you have a small number of employees, you'd be expected to know it in great detail what each person is doing. If you have a large organization, you may have to delegate your supervisory responsibility. But if you delegate responsibility, it's imperative on you to instruct your subordinates with supervisory responsibility what they must do. So violations may occur despite a strong compliance system. If a subordinate engages in illegal or unethical activities, respond promptly. Investigate to determine the scope. Increase the supervision if they're still employed. Maybe limit activities, and then continue to review procedures. Okay, let's look at a couple of cases for standard 4C. Phillips is a branch manager of an investment advisory firm supervising a number of employees. Compliance procedures for all offices are developed and implemented by a compliance team at corporate headquarters. All employees are required to conduct their personal investment activities through the firm, so the firm can manage any conflict of interest. Philip allows one employee, Lewis, to work from home. Unknown to Phillips, Lewis makes security trades through an account on an online broker and has an investment account at another advisory firm. Phillips' actions as supervisor are inappropriate because Phillips did not adequately supervise Lewis. Okay, so, all right, I'll let you read through the other two cases. So, compliance practices. Identify situations in which violations are likely to occur. Establish and enforce compliance procedures. And then adequate compliance procedures include clearly written and accessible code of ethics, hierarchy of supervision, designate a compliance officer with authority and resources, outline procedures for monitoring and testing, outline procedures for reporting violations. Practices also include disseminate contents of the compliance program, update procedures as necessary, educate personnel regarding the compliance procedures, review employee conduct, incorporate a professional conduct evaluation as part of the performance review. And then finally, required to appropriately supervise subordinates to ensure they comply with applicable laws and regulations. Understands what constitutes an adequate compliance system. Bring an inadequate compliance system to the attention of management. If they refuse to make revisions, decline supervisory responsibility. And implementing a code of ethics is a critical component of an appropriate compliance program.